So the work consists essentially of 3 short films, which are called After the Crash, Before the Crash, and Crash. And I first started shooting the film after I saw a picture of an airplane graveyard in Mojave in California. And that's an interesting graveyard or an interesting location because during each financial crisis, planes get stored at this graveyard because it's unprofitable to operate them. So they get parked or stored. The older ones also get dismantled and scrapped for parts or scrapped altogether for aluminum. And because it's very close to Hollywood, there's also a force way of dealing with the planes, which is to use them in Hollywood movies and stage plane crashes and explosions and all sorts of things with the planes. So I had this initial fantasy, which was that a plane would be, stored there because of the financial crisis, then blown up for a Hollywood film. The debris would be collected, shipped to China, where it would be converted into recycled aluminum. Then DVDs would be made using that aluminum, and the pirated version of the film in which the plane is blown up initially would be printed, on these DVDs, so that essentially the film where the plane is blown up would be printed on the remnants of the plane itself. For me, it's just one more step in an investigation of the materiality of digital media, because I'm used, digital media or digital images are always described as being immaterial, uncorporeal, idealists in a way. But they do have, of course, a material base. They do need a material support, a whole infrastructure, in which they are being produced, circulated, distributed, and so on. And this bit, absurd recycling business also is part of these endless flows of images which are circulated around the globe at every second. Mike Potter is the first protagonist to appear in the film. He actually owns a salvage business, which does consulting for Hollywood movies and also sells, second-hand parts of planes and also aluminum. I met him at the airport for the first time. So, the camera was already ready to shoot, and here he came, It was amazing. He's such an amazing protagonist, He's like a mythical figure. Also a very interesting life story. He was one of the youngest pilots for TVA ever, and then had to stop flying. And he told me the story of his near-miss crashes. He has this great optimism. I think he's a person who is able to transform every catastrophe into an opportunity. The main protagonist most probably is Kevin, who happened to be the cameraman of the film because I met him 20 years ago when the wall came down in Berlin. We were both working for Wim Wenders at that time. And we stayed in touch, and when I knew that I was going to California, I contacted him, and he greatly helped me to produce the film in the first place. And at the same time, his own, situation started to deteriorate because of the financial crisis. So at a certain point, his, the things that were going on in his life started to eerily resonate with the content matter of the film. And I think it was really gracious from him to accept, not only to show his work alongside the film, but also to talk about the things that happened to him while we were shooting the film. So the other protagonist is actually a great artist and filmmaker who I asked more or less by coincidence, whether he could perhaps, pretend to be an expert of aviation in the film. And then it turned out that these stage scenes worked so well that we kept on extending them. And that was also a real surprise for me because, first of all, I didn't plan on working with actors in the first place, and then more than acting, it turned out to be a real collaboration. So that was also really fortunate. But really, rather than an actor, I think it's about trying to collaborate, with the people around you who are sort of involved in the film, and to try to create this work together. Initially, I planned really to do a more documentary film, talk to real, experts, protagonists, and so on. But then I had the feeling that ultimately there was no real need to do that, especially in a work which explores the boundary between reality and fiction constantly. So I started to work with staged scenes, or with actors basically, and that worked out so well that I simply continued doing it. And this is more or less how the form of the film was developed through the process. I mean, there was no initial plan to do it. When a film is completed, then I become aware of what I've been doing, and of course these effects produce very interesting meanings. The green screen, for example, has the effect to produce cubist perspectives, perspectives which do not exactly align, which are not subject to the tyranny of the central perspective anymore. It's like a bit like in painting, some forms of 20th century painting, when finally, even cinematography is able to liberate itself from the limitation that the optical lens has imposed onto it. And that's something which became really interesting to me during the process of making it. Well, I think both. I mean, it obviously talks about power relations, because the only way how I could ever start making films was the digital revolution, basically, and the availability of camcorders and high-8 tapes and all this sort of stuff. I mean, I just thought about it. It's really, really amazing. The cameras I had in my life since 1985 have always been more or less the same price. But now the resolution I get is almost the same as 35mm film. It's amazing, but it's a consumer equipment, it's not professional equipment. And this is because I never got substantial funding or anything for these works, but I always was able to do that, to realize them, because of the availability of that technology. On the other hand, it's also aesthetically an interesting medium for me, not only because of the way it looks like, but simply because of the idea that, in essence, anybody could use them. It's an available medium. It's the thing that anybody could take into their hands. And this is the other reason why it's really interesting for me. I call myself a filmmaker and a writer. I was trained as a filmmaker. I sort of became a writer by accident, maybe. But of course, I mean, there are huge differences. I always compare it with being a carpenter and a weaver at the same time. I mean, these are hugely different crafts. You work with different tools, and you produce, of course, different things with different means. So I think they are wildly different. I end up, usually working on one phenomena with different means, once with a camera and once with the other time with a computer keyboard or with a pen. But I think the modes of production and also the results are completely different. Well, I mean, the context in which the work is being viewed or seen are so heterogeneous and dispersed, you can't really tell what effect a work is going to have. What I notice is that probably in each of my work, but very strongly recently in the past works, I end up dealing with the conditions of production of the works themselves. So it's really becoming more a reflection of the conditions of labor in the cultural industries or in the art field or creative industries or however you'd like to label this. And I think that actually, in my view, this is the real political task within the art field. It's not primarily to go out to explore, everything else, but the art field as such is such a site of exploitation and corruption and whatever. It's a political site. It's a site of massive exploitation. So starting to look into these conditions is very interesting.